And within a few months, I was asked to come back. I actually drove the train up the peak for about 4 or 5 years, and then they made me be a conductor again because they discovered the engineer drives the train and he doesn't do much talking. And the boss noticed that every time he was on the train, the people who were in the front row of the train by the engineer were getting a much better talk than the people who in the middle of the train were listening to the conductor talk. So I did a year again as a conductor, and then the next year I started training all the conductors. And I did that up until 2013. But when I was training the conductors, I always told them, I says, there's 10 questions you're going to get asked at the station. And then there's 10 questions you're going to get asked when you get to the summit. And then there's 10 ordinary questions you're going to get asked on the way down, because the conductor talks on the way up, and then on the way down he comes through the train and talks to the passengers and sells things. So I said, none of these questions are going to sound reasonable. Once in a while, there's going to be a question that won't make you laugh. But all 10 of these questions, the people who ask you these questions are perfectly serious. They don't know, they don't realize that what they're saying comes as funny to somebody. In fact, over the years, I've told various people about some of these questions, and they'd say, you ought to write a book about that.
Yeah, I bet.
And I had to explain to it, you can't write a book about it. Because it's one of those things, unless you've experienced some of it, you don't understand how it's funny. In fact, at the end of the day, quite often, many of us would get together and compare notes as to the funniest things that had happened to us during that day. I tell the brand new conductors, this is the first thing you've got to be able to answer these questions with a straight face. And only once in my whole time on the Cog did I get asked a question where I almost split right there. I had never been asked anything quite that funny. And I'll explain it to you. But down at the station, the conductor and the engineer stand at the entrance to the train, and people get on the train. And in the old days, they just got on the train and sit down. Nowadays, you make a reservation, and when you come to the railroad, you get a reserved seat. So the passengers come up and they're trying to figure out what's what on the train, and they'll walk up to whoever's standing there and say, which way's the train going to go? Well, at the station where the train is sitting, on one end of the train, the track goes off into the trees. On the other end of the train, the track goes about this far. And once I got used to the job, I would ask them, I said, where does your ticket say you're going? And they do, they seriously, they actually look at the ticket to see where they're going. We're going to Pikes Peak. Oh, good, you're going that way. But that's not what they want to ask you. Because if you've been in the trains over there since the 1960s, the trains they use have seats facing in both directions, the front of the train and the back of the train. And what they really want to know is, does my seat face forward or does my seat face backwards? The train doesn't turn around. So if you're facing forward on the way up, you're going to be facing backward on the way down. If you're facing backward on the way up, you're facing forward on the way down. Well, I remember one day I was standing there and a fella came up to me and he said, I can't ride in this seat. I gotta be facing the front. And I've heard that statement forever. Well, I'm gonna get sick, you know, and I try to explain to him, it's not like riding in a car. And maybe you get sick riding in the back seat of a car. In fact, with older cars, that was much more common. Because you were a little more confined, it's like being in a motorhome and sitting facing backwards. But, so this guy argued with me the whole time, and he was with a group of about 5 or 6 people. And he insisted that he couldn't ride facing backwards. And I even asked him if somebody in his group could trade, and he showed me where he was sitting. And he says, everybody likes where they're sitting but me. So I explained to him the train was going to be absolutely stuffed. In the summertime it runs, that they can carry 214 people on a train, and it would carry 214 and sometimes 215 people. There'd always be some little kid that had a ticket, but they could squeeze one more person on the train. But anyway, so once we get the doors closed, I look over and I realize where this guy is sitting. He's facing forward, but he thinks the train's going to go the other way. So I was a little concerned on the way down whether he was going to get upset. But by the time the train came down, he realized that the scenery is the same. And it really doesn't bother you when you're only traveling at about 7 miles an hour.
Oh, yeah.
It's not going to do that much to you. But that's just one of the questions. But my favorite questions of them all are the questions that people get asked the conductors and the engineers and everybody at the summit. Now, the common question that everybody makes fun of is something that happens going up. And that's, at what altitude did the deer turn into elk? Well, deer don't turn into elk. But anyway, so when we get up at the top and the people are getting off the train, every now and then somebody will stop and ask a question. And one of my favorites was the fellow who got off the train. He says, "Now, is this the same summit that the highway comes to?" I said, "Yes, sir. There's only one summit to Pikes Peak. And if you look on the other side of the building, you'll see the parking lot, and you'll understand that this is where they come to." Which leads to a question that a guy asked me when the train is getting ready to leave to come down. And he walks up to me and he says, "I'd like to ride the train down." Well, how did you get here? "Oh, I came up on a bus."
Oh.
Oh, well, and it just happened to be a day that we had some available seats on the train. And I explained to him how much the tickets were and things like that. He said, "Well, there's one thing I really need to know." "Okay. Does the train stop at the toll gate?" Now, for those of you who haven't been up Pikes Peak, the railroad comes up the south side of Pikes Peak, and the road comes up the north side of Pikes Peak. And he'd ridden up on this bus, but that bus wasn't going to go back to Colorado Springs. It was going to go on to Cripple Creek. And I needed to explain to him that, no, the train doesn't go down that way. And he was saying, "I don't remember seeing the tracks." I wasn't really sure of that. But as we get older, certain things happen to our bodies. And I'm standing there one afternoon looking out at Woodland Park. Now, Woodland Park is the town you see if you look out Pikes Peak to the north. And there's a gentleman standing there, and he's sort of bewildered. And I walk up to him and he says, "What are all those windmills?" Now, I've seen a lot of strange things on Pikes Peak, but I can't say that I've ever seen a windmill.
Why do you call it windmills.
Yeah, that's, well, and so I asked him, I said, what windmills? He says, those right down there. And he points at Woodland Park. I said, there aren't any windmills down there. He said, oh, come now. I says, no, that's a town down there. So he reaches in his pocket and he gets out his glasses and he puts them on. He said, oh, yeah, those are streets. And I used to enjoy working the winter trains. Now, traditionally, they started in May, sometimes April if they could, and the trains would run until we got a first good snowstorm in the fall, and then they'd stop running. But about 15 years ago, they started running all year round. And now, this time of year, they used to try to run 5 days a week. Now, this year, they're only going to run on Saturdays and Sundays. But to go up and see the snow, strangely enough, the best time to see snow on Pikes Peak is in April and May. But it'll be cold. The weatherman, since they put a camera on the top of Pikes Peak, likes to show what it's like on the top of Pikes Peak. And sometimes they'll even tell you what the temperature is, but usually it's 10 or 15 below zero up there. But in the middle of the summer, there's one animal that everybody sees. Now, is there anybody in the room that doesn't know what a marmot is? Well, I'm standing at the top, as usual, and a passenger gets off the train, and he said, I don't want to be rude, but why do you guys give the Mormons so much trouble? Excuse me? Well, you were talking about those little animals, the Mormons. So, no, those aren't the little animals. Those little animals are marmots. Oh, and then a similar incident where somebody came up and says, "I've never seen such big maggots." Oh no, marmots. Or why are the groundhogs so big up here? Yeah, they're a groundhog. Yeah. And then somebody will come up and say, "Those prairie dogs." No, they're not prairie dogs. Prairie dogs are a different animal. They're marmots. And we're on the way down one day and we haven't seen a thing. Haven't seen a marmot? Haven't seen. Of course, the people on the train always got upset with me because I don't get real excited seeing deer. I mean, I've seen more deer in my yard up in Rock Rimmon than I've seen at times on Pikes Peak. But we hadn't seen a thing, hadn't seen a deer, hadn't even seen a squirrel, which is really rare because I've seen some very unusual squirrels in Manitou. But so finally we come around a corner and here is a golden eagle.
Oh.
And it's up in a dead tree, and so it's really standing out. And people are getting really excited about this eagle. And of course, it had been more exciting, but you don't see bald eagles on a Pikes Peak. Do you know why? Do you know what bald eagles eat?
Ices and such.
Well, mainly fish.
Oh.
They're a fish eater. That's why you'll see them along streams and things like that. But a golden eagle is a red meat eater. So here's this holding, and this eagle takes off, and it was magnificent. I mean, it flew right in front of the train, spread its wings out, and everybody up in that end of the train are just ooh and ah. And this eagle flies way up high. And then all of a sudden it turns and it starts to dive. Like, oh man, look at that. Wonder what it's going for. And then you see the marmot. It's, oh. And then about that time it grabs the marmot and it's, ooh. Then they take the marmot and they fly back up high again. Then they drop it. Because they, well, they don't want to eat it when it's alive. And then they go, they drop it, then they go back and get it, and then they have a meal. But the various sounds, the various passengers on the train were both from high glory to very sad. But, and then in the fall, that's the best time to go up and see the bighorn sheep. And one year, there was, now I've seen some strange things on Pikes Peak. Not just the passengers. But I've seen, I missed by one day a buffalo. Yeah, a buffalo. There was a truckload of buffaloes coming from South Park. You may not know they raise buffalo in South Park, and they bring them to the slaughterhouse that's on 21st Street. And they'll bring 6, 8, 10 at a time to the slaughterhouse. And well, the truck broke down at Cascade. And while the guy was trying to change a tire, the buffalo got loose and wandered off into the trees. Buffalo are very interesting animals. They don't like to be confined. And in a truck, I don't think they know where they're going, but they don't want to be there. So the first opportunity, they're going to leave. Well, they eventually found all of them but one. And this one made it all the way around to the south side of Pikes Peak. And finally, the caretaker, who took care of the city reservoirs on the south side, spotted it. And they came up and got it. And then, I don't know whether you all remember, years ago, we had a moose come through town. Well, that moose came over Pikes Peak. And we're coming down the mountain, and one of the people on the train says, "How often do you see moose up here?" I says, "I've never seen a moose up here." He says, "Well, there's one right over there." And sure enough, there was this moose. It followed Ruxton Creek down, and then it went down to Fountain Creek, and then it made its way and spent a lot of time in Monument Valley Park. And the city Park and Rec Department actually had a guy following him. And he would sit in his pickup truck and watch this moose in the park, because the Gazette had gotten a picture of somebody trying to ride it. And they were sure that somebody was going to get hurt, so they made sure that nobody bothered the moose. And that moose made its way, it had come, the Division of Wildlife had got a half a dozen moose from Yellowstone Park. And they planted them down in the San Juan Mountains. And this one moose decided it liked Yellowstone Park better. And it took it about a year to get back. But they figure it made it all the way back to Yellowstone Park. But by far the most unusual animal, and you may have, how well you remember things in the news, but we went up there one day, and here not far from the herd of bighorn sheep is a llama. Well, llamas are herding animals. And the only herds that are up on Pikes Peak in the fall are the bighorns. But the bighorns knew that that wasn't a bighorn. So they didn't want it in their herd. But over a period of about 3 or 4 days, various people on the train would spot it. And finally the word went out, a lady who raised llamas up by Black Forest was missing a llama. So there's actually a llama rescue group And when they heard that the llama was on Pikes Peak, they sent a rescue crew up to Pikes Peak, and they were up there 2 days before they even saw it. And they had us watching and reporting where it was. So the next day, they actually had their own train and snuck up on it. And they actually were able to, they took a llama with them because it would join another llama. So they were walking around up there with this llama, and sure enough, here comes this wild, so to speak, llama, and it joins, they put him on their train and they take him down, and they took it home. But that's got to be the strangest animal that I've ever seen on Pikes Peak, except for Bigfoot. People ask me if I've ever seen Bigfoot, and yes, I've seen Bigfoot on Pikes Peak. At least I think that's what I saw. Now, there used to be a teacher who taught in the Manitou School District. And every summer, he had a gorilla suit. And he would hide in the trees, and when the train came by, he'd jump out from behind the trees and wave at the people on the train.
Oh, boy.
And then he would run back into the trees and hide again. But this wasn't the guy in the gorilla suit, because I saw the guy in the gorilla suit. Well, I was going up the mountain one day, and I saw this strange looking tree. You know, that tree looks like a Bigfoot. Well, on the next trip up, I realized there wasn't a tree where I saw this tree that looked like Bigfoot, so I guess I saw Bigfoot. But we were coming down off the mountain one day, and I was, in the summertime, they will sometimes run 2 trains at the same time. They have 2 kinds of trains over there, and strangely enough, they're called a big train and a little train. The little trains, they started buying in the 1960s, and they carry 80 people. And when they decided they liked these switched trains, they ordered some bigger trains, the ones that carry 216 people. And they'll run a big train and a little train together, not connected, but at the same scheduled time. And we stop and we meet the trains in the opposite directions on our trip. Well, one of the spots where we pass other trains is Minnehaha. Now, Minnehaha was actually a community at one time. The University of Minnesota would send botany students to Pikes Peak, and they would study the wildflowers and the trees and various things, and they had this little camp at Minnehaha. And that makes another interesting story. But now Minnehaha is just a place where the trains pass. And when we got down at the station, the conductor on the train in front, and I was the conductor on the train, little train behind, he said, "Did you see that bear across the creek at Minnehaha?" And it's like, "Yeah, I saw it." He says, "When we came around the corner, I'll swear that bear stood up and waved at the train." I said, "You sure it wasn't a gorilla?" He looked at me, he didn't know about the guy. He said, "No, that was that bear that stood up and waved at us." I said, "I bet it didn't." But if you hike Bar Trail, along the trail, if you're really good at flowers and things, especially flowers, you'll find flowers up there that don't belong here. They're not native to this area, because the University of Minnesota would bring plants here and see if they would grow. They were determined, and this is at least 100 years ago, that given the right amount of sun and the right amount of water and the right kind of soil, things will grow anywhere. And that's not true. There are certain plants that don't like high altitude. There are certain plants that don't like certain kinds of soil, and certain temperatures especially. And the season has to be right. But there are wildflowers that aren't really, they're more domestic flowers, we would call them now. And one of my favorites is a certain variety of snapdragon that you'll find on Pikes Peak. That's not native to this area because they brought it here and it planted it, and it liked it here. But in fact, this professor from the University of Minnesota wrote a whole book on wildflowers of Colorado that are things that he just saw on Pikes Peak. In fact, one of the unusual flowers that was discovered on Pikes Peak, that's a very hard flower to find on Pikes Peak, is the Colorado blue columbine. I only know 2 or 3 places on Pikes Peak where you'll find the blue columbine. But that's where Dr. Edwin James, who was the first person to get to the top of Pikes Peak that we know of, first saw the columbine. And it wasn't until, I believe it was the 1930s, that the columbine actually became the Colorado state flower. But, you know, when I leave here tonight and drive home, I'm going to remember all sorts of stories that I could have told you tonight. I did this for a group down in Pueblo several years ago, and that's exactly what happened. At one time, one of the conductors on the train swore that they saw a plane crash. So when the train got to the top, they called down to the station and asked if there were any reports of airplanes missing. And they said, no, not that we know of. And a passenger had seen it and had pointed it out to the conductor. When they were at the top, somebody got a nice pair of binoculars and they looked around and they thought they saw the plane crash. So they called the Civil Air Patrol. The Civil Air Patrol went out and they started searching the south side of Pikes Peak to see if they could find this plane crash. You know what they found? A tree that looks just like a plane crash. Yeah, the big branches pointing off in the right directions, but from the top of Pikes Peak, it looked just like a plane crash. But when you were right over the top and looking down, you could see that it was a tree. It's, you know, that back when the federal government started the Weather Bureau, one of the places that they had one of their first weather stations was on the top of Pikes Peak. They would have anywhere from 4 to 6 soldiers that lived on the top of Pikes Peak all year round. And they built the original Summit House in 1873. And one of the first characters to get assigned up there, yeah, his name would come to me. But every week, one of the soldiers would come into town for groceries. Now, since we're all natives here, you may know that in the early days, Colorado City was not the kind of town that Colorado Springs was.
Other than savory.
Well, not necessarily unsavory, but they lived at a different level. Well, they would get most of their supplies in Old Colorado City rather than Colorado Springs because they could spend the time while they were waiting for whatever supplies they were getting to be gathered up, they could do something else. But this one particular soldier had a habit of, when he was in the saloons in Old Colorado City, would tell stories about living on the top of Pikes Peak. And one of the most famous stories is his wife and child, and the child who got eaten by the rats. And if you haven't heard that story, I'm not going to repeat it, but it's not true. Because number one, the Army wouldn't let him have a wife up there. And the main reason they told these stories was to get people from town to come up so they'd have somebody new to talk to. When you're living at 14,000 feet, and then in the wintertime, when they've got weather like we've had the last few days, they stay indoors as much as they can, even though they've got to go outside every 4 hours to take a record of what the weather is. I happen to know quite a variety of members of the Atamag Club. I've met quite a few over the years, and this was an interesting year for him to go up on Pikes Peak. Well, it's always cold up there this time of year, but this year there was hardly any wind. And it can blow 40, 50, 60 miles an hour on the top of Pikes Peak. And I've been on the top of Pikes Peak when the wind was actually blowing at 100 miles an hour. And you don't stand up even when you're my size at 100 miles an hour. But this year, things were nice and calm and really cold. And they enjoyed that much better than they did a few years ago when they actually had to make a detour, and they came up the highway. They usually use Bar Trail, but the weather was such a few years ago that they did the highway. Another interesting question that I've been asked, and people in this group may know this one, but do you remember the airplane on the top of Pikes Peak? Yes, there was an airplane on the top of Pikes Peak. Back in World War I, they actually tested aircraft engines because they would take them up on a truck, and they would set up on the top of Pikes Peak and run them, and it was like flying at high altitude, so they could do tests on them. And then in World War II, when they developed jet engines, they also took jet engines to the top of Pikes Peak and did the same thing, because they could be at an altitude where they would fly. But so the Air Force decided that they were going to put up an airplane on the top of Pikes Peak to commemorate the fact that they tested airplane engines up there. Well, they made one considerable mistake. Now, airplanes are designed to go through the wind. But when the wind is coming from the side, airplanes don't like that. And they knew that an airplane is designed to lift off the ground when the winds get to be a certain level. And the winds blow on the top of Pikes Peak at that level all the time. So they anchored this airplane really good into the rocks. And it was only up there 1 year because it was okay in the summer. But when they went up the next spring, about half the airplane was gone. The wind had literally blown it away. If they'd have built a platform so that the airplane could be like a wind vane and swivel in the wind, it'd have probably survived. But I would get people on the train ask me, whatever happened to the airplane up here? And I really didn't know. And then several years later, I did some research and I found out what happened to it. But the folks that run the Summit House ran across a whole bunch of postcards that they used to sell at the top of Pikes Peak. And one of them was of the airplane. So now you can go up to the top of Pikes Peak and you can buy these old postcards that are actually modern postcards, and one of them is of the airplane. But before they had it up on the top of Pikes Peak, during Armed Forces Day, it was sitting over here at, that would be Kiowa and Weber, right there at the City Auditorium, before they took it up to the top of Pikes Peak. I got to talking with one of the guys who worked on the maintenance crew on the highway. He says, "Oh yeah, the airplane's still here. It's down in our junk pile." And a guy who worked out at Pete out at the museum
Yeah.
out there came up and looked at it and decided they didn't have one like that airplane. And he spent the time to dig it out of the junk pile and get it all ready. Unfortunately, he passed away before it got moved down to the museum. But I keep reminding the guys at the museum that there's this airplane waiting for them on the top of Pikes, or actually halfway up Pikes Peak near Glen Cove. But it's still staying there. But you know, people often ask me, what's the funniest thing that ever happened to you on Pikes Peak? And it's got to be this story. Now, it takes quite a while to get 214 people off of a train when there's just 2 doors to go out. And I'm standing on the train and I can see there's a lady out there. And if I didn't know better, I'd think that she was waiting outside the restroom because she was that anxious. But she wanted to get back on the train. There's no bathroom on the train. So finally, when everybody's done, everybody's off the train, she comes right up to me. She gets right in my face and she says, "You need to warn these people." And it's like, okay. I do a lot of warning of people. What do you think I need to warn these people about? You need to warn these people about the grease. Well, the first thing that comes into my mind is she hasn't had time to go into the Summit House and get a donut. So she's not talking about that grease. Because their donuts, if you catch them at the wrong time, can be kind of greasy. So I said, "Well, ma'am, just what do you mean?" And this is where the funny part comes in. Without even blinking, she says, "I laid my son across the track to take his picture, and he got grease on his shirt."
Wow.
Well, ma'am, I don't think I've ever warned anybody about that before. And I was trying to figure out how not to just erupt in laughter because I'd never heard anything quite like that. But, you know, all the time up there, people would come up to the train, especially in the evening, and say, "Can I get a ticket on the train to go down?" And, you know, I'd tell them what it was and how many want to go down. Just one. My wife rode up with me, and she's not going to ride down with me. So I need to get her on the train if I can. So and usually it was the case like that. And in one case, it was the husband and the wife was driving. But the best one is I get on the train in Manitou and there's 6 guys in a group. And you can tell by the leathers that they're wearing that they're motorcyclists. So I asked the guy, "You guys going up, huh? You don't want to ride up?" And "Oh no, there's 6 other guys. They're riding the motorcycles up. When we get to the top, they're going to ride the train down and we're going to ride the motorcycles down." That's good. So we get to the top, and by this, you know, when you ride the train, you only see part of the road. You see just very little bit of the road, because it's on, like I say, it's mainly on a different side of the mountain. Well, what happened is the guys who rode up on the train decided they didn't want to ride motorcycles down that road. And the guys who rode the motorcycles up were certainly waiting to ride the train down. And here were 12 guys in a very interesting discussion as to who was going to ride what down Pikes Peak. You know, they do the car race to the top of Pikes Peak. And one year they asked the racers, would you consider racing down? And they got an immediate, no, we're not racing down. Even ones like Bobby Unser, who's raced up that mountain many, many times, he was one of the most to say, no, I'm not racing down this mountain.
No.
But eventually, the six guys got on the train. 3 of them had come up on the same train, and they were riding the same train down. And there were 3 guys going to ride motorcycles down that didn't want to ride motorcycles down Pikes Peak. Now, there's novelties with Pikes Peak. I met a man whose goal was to go up Bar Trail to the top of Pikes Peak 100 times in a year. Yeah. I read the old newspapers in town, and I've read newspapers where somebody did Bar Trail for the 100th time, and it took them like 20 years to do it.
Oh.
But this guy was going to do it all in 1 year, and it almost killed him because he got stuck in the winter up there in some pretty bad snowstorms. In fact, it absolutely destroyed his health, and he had to leave the region. But he only made it like 95 times. But it was kind of funny because he would do the marathon every year, only he wouldn't run. He had a good pace, and he would walk it. And when he got up to altitude, he could outwalk some of the runners. Because when they get up to the top, they're winded and and every year he would place in the marathon. You know, he wouldn't win it, but he'd be up there, you know, within the top 10 or 15 people, and he was only walking. But I think that when I was a kid, and maybe some of you might remember this, somebody pushed a peanut up the highway. You know, the old hazing trick of having somebody push a peanut with their nose. Well, this guy actually did that. Another guy pushed a piano. It wasn't really a piano, it was just a piano case up Pikes Peak, and it took him like 3 days. Well, I think I've drug you on these tales of Pikes Peak enough. But if anybody does have a comment or a question or something, I'd be happy to answer any, if you will. Yes?
What time of the year are the wildflowers the best?
The best time for the wildflowers, depending upon what the spring does.
Oh.
See, because the spring can make the wildflowers a couple of weeks late. But the best time is right at the end of June and the beginning of July. But there are some wildflowers that don't come out until August or even into September. But the prettiest ones, if you see the columbines and the various other ones, the last week in June and the first week in July is usually the best time.
And where on the peak is it?
You'll see them all the way.
All the way.
In fact, one of my favorite questions that only gets asked for about 6 weeks out of the year, or a minute too, is there are trees near the station that have a kind of flower on them that most of us know. But a lot of people don't apparently get lilacs where they live. And people will ask me, what are those blue or what are those purple flowers? Well, at the same time, there's another variety of trees over there with little round red berries. They start off as a dark red, and then they get bright red, and they'll stay on the trees all winter. And in the spring, they're like little maroon raisins, and the birds love them. But they are as hard as rocks all summer. And if you would take one and try to eat it, they're extremely bitter. They make rhubarb look like cane sugar. And they're called rowan, R-O-W-A-N. They're rowan berries. And it's a native to Europe and England. When some of the English settlers here in Colorado Springs came over, some of them brought cuttings and planted them over in Manitou. And that's where they came from. But in the midsummer, they'll start to be very colorful. And the tourists from various parts of the country who've never seen them before don't know what they are. And I didn't know what they were, but when I came to work for the Cog Railroad, we had a guy who had come here with the Army, who was actually raised in England. He knew right away what they were. He explained the whole history of it. But that's one of the more interesting plants you see up there. But yeah, you'll see starting down at the station with the lilacs and the rowan berries and all the way up the mountain, the various high altitude. You know, you go through 4 life zones going up Pikes Peak, and you can see the various plants from the different levels. One of my favorite ones is the ones that show up in the late fall that aren't really a flower, but the leaves on the sassafras turn bright red, and people actually think that they're flower petals. Thanks for asking that question. Anybody else?
People still ask about Indians.
Oh yeah, they'll ask what kind of Indians we have here, or lived in this area, and I have to explain that this area was a resort area for the Indians. So we got almost all the Plains Indians and almost all the Mountain Indians from this area.
But nobody thinks that we're still fighting Indians?
Well, no, fortunately. When I was growing up, though, my father was from back in Virginia, and my mother, who grew up here, would get very upset over people back there who thought we still carried 6 guns and fought the Indians. Yeah. Okay?
Okay.
All right. Well, I always enjoy